I wanted to start off with this slide. Do any of you recognise this diagram? Is it familiar? A few nods there. It was published by somebody called John Holden, who will be familiar, to some of you who have read the literature on cultural value in general, not just museums. And John published this in a monograph in 2006, and it was called Cultural Value and the Crisis of Legitimacy. And I wanted to start off with this diagram tonight because I think in a kind of a visual form, it really captures a lot of the context in which the literature which we undertook the critical review of is located. So 2006, New Labour has been in for not quite a decade, but very much nearly part of a decade. And New Labour, of course, came in with a very, very strong agenda of social change. And there were two pillars. Two main pillars of that agenda. One was social inclusion, one was social value. Very important ideas, and ideas I think that in terms of their content were sort of largely embraced by museums. But there was also a lot of controversy around what was called the instrumental agenda, not so much because of the content, but largely because of the way in which it was implemented. And it was implemented through a system called the New Public Management. And it really meant that museums and galleries had to produce evidence that they were implementing and contributing to policy in return for funding. So it was very prescriptive, it was very top-down, and there was very little negotiation about it. And it really created a very interesting atmosphere of kind of contest, but also more conversation, perhaps, than there had ever been around value. And that the sector itself was actually forced to be compliant, but not necessarily quiet in terms of its response to this. There was a lot of contest and a lot of discussion, and some of the discussion was really around the whole idea about this being the instrumental agenda being somewhat narrow and somewhat reductionist. And the argument was, this is not the only type of value that museums and galleries produce. Where, the sector asked, is the institutional value that museums can produce themselves by knowing their publics, by being able to serve their audiences and their communities and their constituencies. Where is that institutional value in this? It actually wasn't there. And where, as importantly, was the value of experience that users have? The user experience in museums, where was that in the instrumental agenda? Where, in fact, another quote from Holden, were all of those wonderful, beautiful, uplifting, challenging, stimulating, thought-provoking, terrifying, etc., 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 experiences that people have in museums? And where was the experience of community? The sense of identity and the sense of place and the sense of belonging. Where was that in the instrumental agenda? So I think the thing about the Cultural Value Project is that it's quite different in that it starts here. It really starts with the intrinsic value of users. And unlike many other national systems for measuring cultural value, and last year I guest edited a dedicated edition of Cultural Trends, and we looked at 4 models of measuring cultural value, one from Australia, one from New Zealand, and one from Canada, and one from the UK. And the three that were not the UK ones, so Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, were all very much focused on that model of being able to demonstrate that public investment in culture has a return against social and economic policy. The one exception was this project. So this project actually decided to start with the experience of users and then find out what difference that made. So it sort of is a complete reverse of the way that governments have actually been going. It was the other thing about it which was very different was its definition of culture. And it was brave and it was bold and it was very encompassing. So it certainly included publicly funded culture, which was really our focus. But it also looked at commercially funded culture and amateur culture and participatory culture like community arts, and also what they're calling homemade culture now. So people sort of knitting in their homes or sort of playing games and stuff like that. But we were really looking at the publicly funded culture set, particularly with museums and galleries. And we looked at literature and we had some questions of it. We wanted to know how that literature helps us to understand the cultural value associated with visiting, strengths and limitations of past approaches, how to understand and evidence the difference that museums and galleries make to society, and what needs to be known about the value of engaging with museums and galleries and the methods by which this can be identified. And so what we did was we reviewed 2 decades of studies within the public domain. We interviewed some key stakeholders. We assessed what the existing studies tell us about value. We summarized the evidence. We distilled it. We took some critical look at the methodological paradigms, and we looked at some of the gaps in terms and weaknesses, and where we might take this forward. Now, when we were interviewing the key stakeholders, one of the issues that came up on a number of occasions was that this data set that we were looking at was very comprehensive. It was UK-wide. It was longitudinal. It had about 2 decades in it. It was looking at all ages and many, many different programs and large museums, small museums, and so on and so forth. But there was a certain concern that was raised by some of the stakeholders that we interviewed that in fact the demographic of people that go to museums and galleries is a narrow one. That in fact this data set might be reflecting a largely white, middle class, highly educated and professional subset. So one of the first things that we did was go to the taking part data, which some of you will be familiar with, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But the taking part data is a survey that was actually started under New Labour but has been continued with the present government, and it's a consortia. It's Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and it's Arts Council England, it's Sport England, and it's English Heritage, and it's actually run through the Office of National Statistics. A very large survey. It has a cohort demographically sampled of about 10,000 people a year. It interviews about 10,000 adults, and it also interviews several thousand children in 2 groups, between 5 and 11 and 11 and 15. It looks at users and non-users of both sport and arts and cultural activity. It gets a lot of demographic information, a lot of participatory information, and some other stuff besides, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And just sort of looking at these figures, what it did reveal was that in fact there have been big efforts in terms of engaging people more with museums and galleries over, the best part of the last decade. And it's now about 53.7%, I think, going on the last statistics, the last taking part bulletin that came out, of the adult population in England that visits a museum or a gallery at least once or twice a year. So that's really quite, quite good. Now, we've gone through an economic recession, and one of the arguments is that this kind of increase in participation may be the result of a cash-strapped public looking for inexpensive leisure options. And certainly in London, where the majority of the free nationals are, that might be true. But in fact, what these figures show is, in fact, the increases have been right across the country. But the other thing that we were interested in was looking at drilling down a bit into the demography. And when you look at who is actually coming to museums on a range of indicators, so ethnicity and illness or disability, employment status and age, in fact, there have been increases there as well. So, the social inclusion agenda takes time to bed in, but in fact there seems to be some evidence that in fact that is exactly happening. What we also found, though, in going through many of the studies was that because museums and galleries during the last 2 decades have really been focused on providing that evidence that they are contributing to policy in return for funding, it's really kind of skewed the way the evaluation and audience research agenda has often been undertaken. And in fact, when we went through this massive mining exercise, we really found that there are not a lot of studies focusing directly on the value of museum and gallery engagement for users from the perspective of the users. And in fact, the data is very dispersed, it's extremely fragmented, and this was kind of a massive mining exercise to find what we could. But what we did find was that users' description of their experience fell into 3 main categories. And one we called active engagement, one well-being, and one connectedness. And the active engagement one, was fascinating because people really described the cognitive processes that they are using in their encounters and in museums of trying to make sense or make meaning of what they are seeing and what they are engaging with. And the interesting thing about the processes that they described is that when you think about the cognitive scale, and any of you who are, sort of former teachers and know, sort of Bloom's taxonomy and things like that, this is not at the lower end of recall and recognition. This is right at the higher end of cognition. This is about analysing and evaluating and synthesising and comparing. So it really does suggest that what is happening in museums is fostering a higher order level of learning. Very, very important. And the other thing people talked about was the impact of that engagement on themselves. And to go back to that Holden quotation, I mean, it's not always comfortable. You know, thinking takes us out of our comfort zone. And it's, you know, it can change us and it can enlighten us, but can also challenge us and shock us and be very, very confronting. So we got those words as well in user descriptions. The other thing we got was a lot of feelings, a lot of very, very positive feelings around what is being described as one aspect of well-being. And well-being is a term which I think is very much emerging into our conversations and our discourse right now. It has sort of a number of different sort of connotations, one of which is a feeling of kind of general wellness and life satisfaction, and a lot of feelings, positive feelings that go with that. And we found a lot of that in the, you know, the way people were describing their experience in museums. They talked about enjoyment and pleasure and stimulation and feeling calm and feeling alive. You know, just that really made me feel alive, is what some people said. So that was all very good. And again, they talked about the impact on them of those feelings. Greater dignity, that was from a homeless person, homeless people. Pride, affirmation, confidence, and a sense of competence. So, you know, all very, very positive things. And the other major category was connectedness. And here it was connectedness with a whole range of things. It was with self, with the universal, with the community, with the past, with place, you know. Very, very interesting. Very, very, a generally sort of really quite positive data set. And it's one type of evidence of how people are experiencing museums and what that means. Now, Jocelyn suggested that I sort of sum this up with some provocation, and I've got 3 provocations. One is just, you know, what we are employing our evaluation and audience research agendas for. And I would say that our relationship with users is changing and that we need to address this much more in the evaluation and audience studies that we're doing. And we know that the user is no longer a passive consumer of the products and the programs and, you know, that we actually generate in museums. We know they're much more involved as co-interpreters of messages and meanings, and you know, Eileen Hooper-Greenhill's work here and Falk and Dierking and Silverman in the States were proponents of that. But I think the technological revolution and the internet has given people an opportunity to be very involved as creators and authors, and they bring those experiences now and those expectations to cultural, you know, engagement, and they expect to be much more co-producers of projects. They're also citizens. They're not just consumers, they're also citizens. They care how public assets are being used for the benefit not just of themselves but other people. And if any of you have read the work of Mark Moore, they are the ultimate authorizers of the value that museums create. So I think that we have to engage users in a different way in the evaluation and audience research we do. They're there in the data set, but they're there largely as respondents in the evaluation of programs that we have developed. But I think we are really moving into a time when we are starting to, they're much more active agents, and we are starting to share authority. And therefore it's very necessary to find out not what they think of the programs that we create, but what sort of programs they think we should be creating. So there's a very, very changing relationship there. I think the other, you know, part of the Cultural Value Project was we started with the users' descriptions of their experience in museums and galleries in order to see where, you know, what difference that actually made. And my question is, do museums make a positive difference to society? Because we all want to believe this. But that, you know, there's a kind of an assumption that all of these very positive things like active engagement and well-being and connectedness are somehow going to accrue to the public realm through some sort of osmotic process. And in fact, you know, we haven't got a lot of evidence that it actually does that. It may be that they do, we just don't have the evidence, and we're basically underutilizing the evidence that we've got. There is some in the Taking Part survey, and besides all the demographic and participation data, it also is using a kind of a very interesting technique called subjective well-being rating scale so that people can put a numerical value on an intrinsic feeling. So for example, if they go to a museum, they can rate it on a scale from boring to brilliant, basically. But they can also talk about their own well-being states and rate them. And there are indices for trusting communities and sense of belonging. Now, it is possible to take all of these statistics and actually, cross-reference them with museum participation. And if we were doing that, if we were actually drilling down into some of the existing data sets we've got, we may be able to get the evidence to demonstrate that museums actually do make a difference in the public realm. At the moment, we've got a lot of passion, a lot of advocacy, and many, many claims, and not a lot of evidence. And the final thing is, sort of looking back at this study, which Jocelyn and Richard and I completed and published about 6 months ago. It's interesting when you revisit something that you've done, and it really made me think that there's a kind of a convergence happening. And I would throw that out to you. I'm just very interested in your reactions to this. And part of the AHRC Cultural Value Project is looking to find some sort of a language around which we can discuss cultural value. And it certainly within museums and galleries, I wonder whether or not part of our language is beginning to coalesce around well-being. And I say that because there's a lot of stuff around well-being at the moment, and we often think about it in terms of those positive feelings. We have general life satisfaction, or we feel happy, or we feel sad, or there's an absence of depression or something like that. And all of that is very important. It's one subset of well-being. It's individual well-being, and so are the other things that came out of this study: the self-esteem, the vitality, etc., etc. But there's also another dimension of well-being, which is social, and that is around belonging and trust. And if you go on to the Office of National Statistics and just sort of type in well-being, you'll find that they're also doing a major survey every year about well-being. And it is all of these sorts of things in terms of individual indicators, relationships with people in your family and in your social networks, how you feel about work, how you feel about economics, and so on and so forth. So it's very much it's on the national agenda. And it just seems that there's kind of a kind of where that triangle was started off as a kind of a contest, where the 3 points in the triangle were actually sort of dispersed, and it was a contest of one or the other. It now seems to me that, in fact, there's a movement in similar sort of directions. We have users in museums describing their experience in social and personal well-being terms. We have well-being on the national agenda with sort of a number of the projects that I've mentioned. And when you look at the Museums Association strategic plan, social benefit is one of its pillars. You've got the Happy Museum project. You've got a lot of museums who are really thinking about directing their assets towards positive experiences for the individuals and the communities that they serve. And so I wonder whether or not we're moving away from that sort of either-or diagram to something which is much more coalescing around one idea. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.